At 5:30 a.m. on December 21, 1944, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood in a cold, dimly lit basement, eyes fixed on a map of Bastogne, Belgium. Outside, German tanks were closing in, positioning themselves for an assault. McAuliffe's forces were surrounded, cut off from the outside world, and vastly outnumbered. With no reinforcements in sight and limited ammunition, the situation seemed dire. Yet McAuliffe's response would go down in history as one of the most iconic moments of We Too. Picture the scene. 18,000 American soldiers, many without winter clothing, low on supplies, trapped in a town where German forces were closing in from all sides. There was no way out. The temperature was plummeting below freezing, and every move the Germans made felt like a death sentence for McAuliffe's men. It was an impossible situation, one where surrender seemed like the only way out. But McAuliffe wasn't about to give up. Instead, he saw an opportunity. What the Germans thought was a trap was actually a perfect opportunity to outmaneuver them. McAuliffe understood something crucial. The Germans, by surrounding Bastogne, were concentrating their forces in one place. A deadly mistake that would soon turn into their downfall. While the Germans thought they were closing in on a trapped enemy, they were actually falling right into a well-laid American plan that would bleed them dry. Before we dive deeper into how McAuliffe turned the tables on the Germans and made history with his leadership, hit that subscribe button and a like this video to stay connected with incredible untold stories from the past. Trust me, this is one you won't want to miss. So take a moment, hit subscribe, and let's uncover the true story behind one of the most incredible defensive stands in history. Now, let's jump back into the story of how McAuliffe and his men faced overwhelming odds with nothing but their determination, strategy, and unwavering will to survive. Bastogne, located at the crossroads of crucial roadways, was a key strategic point. If the Germans captured it, they could push through to the west, disrupting the Allies' plans and gaining an advantage that would be hard to recover from. But McAuliffe and his 18,000 men knew they weren't just fighting for the town. They were fighting to stop the entire German offensive in its tracks. The Germans were in a race against time. They had to take Bastogne and continue westward to the Meuse River before reinforcements could arrive. This was the last desperate push by Hitler's forces to turn the war in their favor, and Bastogne stood directly in their path. If they took control of the town, they could disrupt the entire Allied defense. But what the Germans didn't know was that McAuliffe's position, surrounded as it was actually a strategic advantage. McAuliffe knew that the Germans, desperate to seize control of Bastogne, were committed to their siege. And while they were focused on the town, they were neglecting one crucial element of warfare: flexibility. The Germans had committed so much of their armor to the siege of Bastogne that they couldn't move it elsewhere. It was a mistake McAuliffe would exploit to the fullest. Now imagine the weight of that realization. McAuliffe understood that the Germans had surrounded them, but what they didn't know was that by doing so, they had essentially sealed their own fate. Bastogne wasn't just a strategic position, it was a choke point. It controlled the roads that the Germans desperately needed for their supply lines. Every tank they sent to surround the town was one less that could move forward. Every gun they aimed at the Americans was one less that could fight elsewhere. McAuliffe's defense wasn't just about holding Bastogne, it was about making the Germans pay a price they couldn't afford to pay. You have to wonder, in McAuliffe's position, how many leaders would have given in to the pressure and surrendered? But McAuliffe wasn't like other commanders. He understood the value of psychological warfare as much as physical defense. When the Germans sent their demand for surrender, asking for the Americans to give up the town, they expected compliance. They expected McAuliffe to throw in the towel and end the fight. But instead, McAuliffe responded with one word: nuts. You can almost imagine the confusion on the German side when they heard this. What could that possibly mean? McAuliffe had just thrown a wrench into their carefully planned assault. And that's where the true brilliance of McAuliffe's strategy shines through. It wasn't just the defense of Bastogne that mattered. It was how McAuliffe turned what looked like a disastrous situation into a trap for the Germans. Now, before we go any further, if you're gripped by this incredible story of defiance and military genius, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. By subscribing, you're joining a community that celebrates history's untold stories, the ones that shape the world we live in today. You don't want to miss what comes next in this epic tale. So let's pick up where we left off. The Germans were determined to take Bastogne, and McAuliffe's forces were ready to stand their ground. But it wasn't just about holding a town. It was about the roads, the critical lifelines that connected the Germans to their objectives. McAuliffe knew that the Germans couldn't move forward without those roads, and as long as the Americans controlled them, the Germans would be stuck. McAuliffe's next step was to rally his commanders, to prepare them for the fight ahead. He called a meeting with his senior officers in the basement of his command post, spreading a map of the town on the table. This was where McAuliffe explained his plan. Getting surrounded might seem like a disaster, but in reality it would force the Germans to make a critical mistake. The Germans, McAuliffe explained, had one objective: speed. They needed to capture the town and use it as a launching pad to push westward. But to do that, they would have to control the roads that led to Bastogne. And that's exactly what McAuliffe was going to deny them. The plan was simple but effective. Bastogne was the key to the road network in the Ardennes. If the Americans could hold it long enough, they could prevent the Germans from advancing further, giving Allied reinforcements time to break through and tip the scales in favor of the Americans. As the German forces began tightening their grip around Bastogne, the hours stretched out for the men inside. The siege was far from a quick, easy affair. The days were cold and relentless, and the men of the 101st Airborne, along with the small contingents of the 10th Armored Division and other units scattered around Bastogne, fought not only the enemy, but also the brutal winter. Food was scarce, medical supplies were dwindling, and ammunition was being rationed. Every shot had to count. The American soldiers were hungry, exhausted, and freezing in the biting cold. Most of them were without winter gear, having arrived without adequate supplies, and those who had made it to the town were now facing a situation that seemed impossible to survive. Yet despite these overwhelming odds, there was a collective spirit among the defenders of Bastogne. They were determined. They were resolute. McAuliffe's strategy wasn't just about holding out. It was about draining the Germans, forcing them to waste their resources, to commit their divisions to an assault they couldn't win. The key to the whole thing, McAuliffe knew, was patience. The Germans were under pressure to move fast, to push westward before American reinforcements could arrive. Every minute spent attacking Bastogne was another minute the Americans had to organize a counterattack. Another minute they had to stall the Germans and buy the time they needed to regroup. Meanwhile, McAuliffe's men were preparing for what they knew was coming. The Germans would launch their attacks in waves, probing the defenses, looking for weaknesses. They had to. That's how they fought. But McAuliffe and his commanders were ready. They knew the enemy would come down the roads, and they knew where to set their defenses. The first test came on the afternoon of December 20th, 1944. The Germans launched their first probe at the American positions, sending in a small company of infantry. The soldiers of the 327th Glider Infantry were dug in and ready. As the Germans advanced, the Americans let them get within 200 meters of their positions. Then, with deadly precision, they opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, rifles, all coordinated to hit the enemy at the right moment. The attack was over in just 8 minutes. The Germans retreated, leaving 32 dead and several wounded behind. The Americans had suffered only 3 casualties. It was a small victory, but one that boosted morale. The Germans had tried to break through, but they hadn't even come close. More importantly, McAuliffe and his commanders had just proven that their defenses were working, that the Germans couldn't easily crack them open. But McAuliffe knew this was only the beginning. As the Germans regrouped and prepared for their next assault, McAuliffe's men were already digging in deeper, preparing to meet them head-on. This was a battle that could not be won with force alone. It had to be won with preparation, patience, and a deep understanding of the terrain. The German attacks came in waves. At 5:30 p.m., another German assault, this time larger and more organized, hit the 5001st Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Uli. The Germans were using tanks this time, heavier, more powerful tanks and infantry support. The attack came from the south, advancing along the road toward the American positions. The soldiers of the 5001st held their ground, using anti-tank guns and artillery to take out 3 German tanks in the first 90 seconds of the attack. The rest of the German force quickly pulled back. Their advance halted once again. This was not just a matter of holding Bastogne for the Americans. This was a battle of attrition, where each German failure to break through was another nail in the coffin of their offensive. The more they attacked, the more they lost. Each failed assault cost them precious time and resources. By now, McAuliffe had figured out exactly what was happening. The Germans were running out of time. The more they tried to take Bastogne, the further behind schedule they fell. They needed to keep moving west, but they couldn't because of the constant pressure from the American defenders. And as every minute ticked by, the Allies were closing in. One of the most remarkable aspects of McAuliffe's strategy was how he used the Germans' own speed against them. The Germans were racing to capture Bastogne and then move forward. But McAuliffe knew that the more they concentrated on Bastogne, the more it would tie up their forces. What McAuliffe was doing was drawing the Germans in, forcing them to attack him in a fixed position, where they would be easy targets for American artillery, air power, and well-positioned infantry. As the days passed, McAuliffe's forces continued to hold their lines despite dwindling supplies. The defenders had little to work with, but they were making it count. They had no choice but to make every round of ammunition, every ration of food, and every moment count. On December 22, 1944, the Germans made another attempt to break the American perimeter, but this time, they paid a heavy price. They threw everything they had into this assault, including tanks, infantry, and artillery. But the Americans were waiting. As soon as the Germans got close, the Americans opened fire with everything they had. The attack faltered, and once again the Germans were forced to retreat, leaving behind a trail of dead and destroyed vehicles. By now, the situation in Bastogne was reaching a critical point. The Germans were becoming more frustrated as each of their assaults failed. They hadn't expected the Americans to fight like this. They hadn't expected the Americans to hold on for so long. The siege had become a battle of attrition, and the Germans were losing. They had underestimated the tenacity of McAuliffe and his men, and they were beginning to realize that they had made a grave mistake by surrounding Bastogne. Meanwhile, McAuliffe's commanders were beginning to receive word that American reinforcements were on the way. General George Patton's Third Army was moving in from the south, pushing through German lines to relieve Bastogne. McAuliffe knew that the reinforcements would be the turning point. They didn't just need to hold on, they needed to make sure the Germans couldn't break through until the cavalry arrived. And so the battle continued, the pressure mounting on both sides. The Germans knew that the clock was ticking, and that they had to break Bastogne or risk losing the momentum of their entire offensive. But the Americans knew something that the Germans didn't. They had already won the psychological battle. The Germans had given their best shots and had failed. Now, it was just a matter of time before the Americans turned the tide. But the real question was, could the Americans hold out long enough to survive until their reinforcements arrived? Would McAuliffe and his men be able to maintain their defense, or would the Germans finally break through? With each passing hour, the tension in Bastogne grew, and the fate of the battle hung in the balance. By December 23, 1944, the pressure on the defenders of Bastogne was reaching a boiling point. The cold was unbearable. The supplies were running dangerously low, and morale, though high in some areas, was beginning to fray. The American forces had been holding out against wave after wave of German attacks, but now the clock was truly ticking. The Germans were running out of time, but so were the Americans. The critical resupply that everyone was waiting for was still days away, and until then, every man in Bastogne would have to continue fighting on minimal rations and whatever they could scavenge from the surrounding terrain. The Germans, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly desperate. Their high command had promised a swift victory. After all, they had completely surrounded the town, and the Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of supplies. But what they didn't realize, and what McAuliffe had understood from the start, was that every day spent attacking Bastogne was a day lost. The more they tried to break through, the more they exposed themselves to American counterattacks. And the longer they spent fighting for this small town, the further behind schedule their entire offensive would fall. McAuliffe's genius lay in his ability to see beyond the immediate crisis. He knew that if he could just hold out long enough, the Germans would either have to pull back or face total collapse, and that's exactly what started to happen. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. For the first time in days, the skies were blue, and as McAuliffe looked up from his command post, He saw something that would change the course of the battle. High above the battlefield, American planes were flying low, coming into view with a roar. The skies were filled with C-47 transport planes, each carrying vital supplies that would mean the difference between life and death for the men in Bastogne. The air was filled with the sound of engines, and then the supplies began to fall. The Americans had pulled off an incredible operation, a massive airdrop to resupply the defenders of Bastogne. C-47s, escorted by American fighters, dropped hundreds of tons of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and other critical supplies to the men holding the perimeter. In a matter of hours, the men who had been starving and low on ammunition now had the means to fight back. They could hold their ground. The hope that had been fading slowly returned. The impact of the resupply was immediate. The artillery, which had been restricted to just 10 rounds per gun per day, now had enough shells to fire 40 rounds per gun. The infantry, who had been conserving every bullet, now had enough ammunition to defend themselves properly. The medical stations, running dangerously low on supplies, now had the materials they needed to treat the wounded. The resupply operation wasn't just a logistical success, it was a psychological one too. It showed the men in Bastogne that they were not alone, that help was coming, and that their sacrifices had not been in vain. The German forces, watching from the outside, were just as stunned by the airdrop as the Americans were relieved. The Germans had expected the siege to be over soon, but instead the Americans had been rearmed and refueled. The message was clear. The siege was not going to break the Americans. The Germans, who had thought they were closing in on a victory, were now confronted with an enemy that was stronger than ever. But McAuliffe wasn't done yet. The resupply was just the beginning. Now that the Americans had the ammunition and supplies they needed, it was time to turn the tide. The next step in his plan was to use the newfound strength to destroy the German forces one by one. But the problem was still the same. Every German tank, every German soldier was a serious threat. They had to be handled carefully, systematically, and that's exactly what McAuliffe did. American fighter bombers, specifically the P-47 Thunderbolts, were soon called into action. These aircraft, equipped with bombs and machine guns, began flying close support missions against the German positions around Bastogne. The Germans, who had already suffered heavy casualties from artillery and infantry attacks, were now exposed to the devastating precision of American air power. The P-47 swooped in, strafing the German tanks, bombing their positions and destroying vehicles in rapid succession. The German soldiers, already demoralized, found themselves under attack from the sky as well as from the ground. McAuliffe watched as the German tanks, which had once seemed unstoppable, were now being set alight by the relentless attacks from the air. The Americans had the upper hand, and now the Germans were feeling the full force of their mistake. They had concentrated their forces around Bastogne, thinking it would be their victory. But instead they had become trapped, surrounded by American forces and American firepower that they couldn't match. Meanwhile, the men inside Bastogne were energized. The fighters in the sky were their own personal saviors, providing air support that made every attack easier to counter. The airdrop had given them the supplies they needed to keep going, and now, with the skies cleared and the Germans in disarray, the Americans were ready to deliver the final blow. But even though things were looking up for the defenders, McAuliffe knew that the battle was far from over. The Germans would continue to fight, and they would continue to send in more forces in an attempt to break the American perimeter. But each time they tried, McAuliffe's forces were ready. They had their artillery positioned in the right places. Their infantry knew exactly where the Germans would attack. And, crucially, the air support continued to rain down destruction on the German positions. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about destroying the enemy's ability to fight, and that's what McAuliffe's men did. They continued to wear down the Germans, and with each attack that failed, the Germans lost more and more momentum. By Christmas Eve, December 24th, the Germans launched another massive assault, hoping to break through the American defenses. This attack would come from the west, and it would be their strongest yet. The Germans sent in the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, supported by tanks and infantry, and they hit the American positions hard. But once again, McAuliffe's men were ready. The Germans, despite initial success in penetrating the perimeter, quickly ran into a wall of resistance. American tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry all combined to stop them in their tracks. German tanks were destroyed or immobilized, and their infantry, unable to make progress, fell back. The Christmas attack, which had been the Germans' best chance to break the siege, had failed. The men of Bastogne had done the impossible once again. They had held on, and the Germans were forced to retreat. The tide was turning, and the Americans now knew that victory was within their reach. As the dust settled on Christmas morning, December 25, 1944, the atmosphere in Bastogne was filled with a tense, cautious optimism. The Germans had just launched their most intense assault yet, throwing everything they had at the American positions in one final bid to break the siege. They had hoped that with their concentrated attack they could force the defenders to surrender, but once again they had failed. The Americans, though weary and cold, were holding strong, and the Germans were starting to realize that victory in Bastogne was slipping further and further from their grasp. For the men inside the perimeter, Christmas was far from the holiday they had envisioned. There was no warmth, no festive meals, and no respite from the unrelenting pressure of the siege. But they had something far more important: the knowledge that they had survived yet another German assault. Their resilience, their determination, and their unity in the face of overwhelming odds had kept them alive, and now they were closer than ever to victory. They could feel it. On the morning of December 26th, the weather cleared once again, and the skies over Bastogne were filled with the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines. This time it wasn't just the fighters providing close support. It was the much-anticipated relief. General George Patton's Third Army had finally broken through the German lines to the south, and now American reinforcements were on their way to Bastogne. The long-awaited relief column was approaching, and the siege was about to be broken. As the first tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion roared toward the town, McAuliffe and his staff could hardly believe it. After all these days of fighting, of enduring endless German assaults, of seeing men fall, the end was finally in sight. The German forces that had surrounded Bastogne were now in full retreat, their offensive shattered, their morale broken. What they had thought was a victory, a final push toward a decisive breakthrough, had turned into their greatest defeat. But the relief wasn't just about the physical reinforcement of troops and tanks. It was a powerful psychological victory. The men inside Bastogne, who had spent so many long days questioning if anyone would come to their aid, now saw their fellow soldiers arriving. They weren't alone anymore. The Americans had held on, and now they would get the help they so desperately needed. But even though the siege was over, the fight wasn't completely finished. The Germans still held some positions around Bastogne, and the road to full liberation would be long. The Americans had won the battle for Bastogne, but there was still work to do. The Germans had taken heavy losses during the siege, but they still had forces in the area, and they wouldn't give up easily. As the reinforcements began pouring into Bastogne, the defenders quickly began reorganizing. The relief column wasn't just about bringing in more troops. It was about restoring the fighting power of the defenders who had been trapped for so long. Tanks, trucks, food, ammunition, and medical supplies arrived in a steady stream. The wounded were evacuated, and the exhausted troops were given the rest they needed to continue the fight. With the pressure lifted, McAuliffe knew the next phase of the battle would be just as crucial. The Germans, though broken and demoralized, were not entirely defeated. They still had the capacity to regroup and launch counterattacks, but McAuliffe's forces now had the momentum. They had held Bastogne when it seemed impossible, and they had shattered the German offensive. The time had come for the Americans to strike back. For McAuliffe, the relief was a bittersweet moment. The battle for Bastogne had cost him and his men dearly. There had been casualties, many of them. Over the course of the siege, 341 men of the 101st Airborne Division had lost their lives, and over 2,600 had been wounded. The 10th Armored Division had lost around 500 men, yet despite these losses, the victory was undeniable. The Germans had failed to break the Americans. The Allies had succeeded in holding one of the most strategically vital towns in Europe. But even in victory, McAuliffe didn't lose sight of the larger picture. He understood that the Battle of Bastogne was just one piece of the larger puzzle. The Germans had lost a significant portion of their remaining armored divisions in the Ardennes offensive, and that loss would have far-reaching consequences. The Germans had committed everything they had to this offensive, and now they were left with little to show for it. The loss of these divisions and their associated supplies would significantly cripple Germany's ability to launch future offensives in the West. While Bastogne had been a victory, it was also a death blow to the German war effort in the West. They had lost thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and a huge amount of morale. The Battle of Bastogne proved to be a turning point, not just for the town itself but for the entire war in Europe. The Germans had been stopped in their tracks, and now the Allies had the momentum to push them back. As the days passed and the smoke of battle slowly cleared, McAuliffe's men began to reflect on what they had achieved. They had held Bastogne for 8 grueling days, and in doing so, they had dealt a devastating blow to the Germans. They had held firm in the face of overwhelming odds, and they had refused to give up. The resilience of the 101st Airborne Division and the other American forces in Bastogne became a symbol of American determination and strength. The story of their victory, of their refusal to surrender, would go down in history as one of the most incredible feats of military endurance. For McAuliffe, the Battle of Bastogne was a defining moment in his career. It was a moment that would earn him the respect of his peers and the admiration of the world. The nuts response to the German surrender offer would become legendary, but it was the actions behind that one word that truly defined his leadership. He had inspired his men to hold on, to fight for every inch, and to never give up. By January 1, 1945, the Battle of Bastogne was effectively over. Though fighting would continue for weeks, the Germans were on the retreat, their offensive in the Ardennes completely shattered. The Allies had regained control of the area, and the road to Germany was now open. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and it had ended in a decisive American victory. As the last of the German forces withdrew from Bastogne, the significance of what had just transpired became even clearer. The Americans had not only held the town, they had crushed the final hope of the German offensive. What had seemed like a desperate last stand was now recognized as one of the most decisive victories of World War II. The Americans had held their ground against all odds, and the Germans had paid an enormous price. The losses for the German forces were staggering. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had entered the battle with over 100 tanks, had lost nearly 90% of its combat strength. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, once a formidable fighting force, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, suffering thousands of casualties. The German High Command was forced to watch in disbelief as their last-ditch effort to break through the Allies in the Ardennes crumbled. The momentum of their offensive permanently lost. On the American side, while the cost was also high, it was a cost that could be replaced. Casualties had been significant. Over 2,500 Americans were lost during the siege, but the 101st Airborne, the 10th Armored Division, and the other American units that fought alongside them had achieved something truly remarkable. They had held the line, bought precious time for reinforcements, and in the end turned the tide of the battle. McAuliffe's leadership had been central to this victory. His decision to hold Bastogne, his unshakable confidence in his men, and his calm under fire were what made the difference. When he responded to the German surrender demand with just one word, nuts, he gave his soldiers something more than just an answer. He gave them a sense of purpose, a defiance that would inspire them to fight even harder. It was a moment that became legendary, a symbol of American grit and determination that echoed across the globe. But the story of Bastogne didn't just end with a victory on the battlefield. The lessons learned in the frozen forests of Belgium would shape American military strategy for decades to come. The importance of holding critical terrain, the use of prepared defenses, and the ability to turn an enemy's strength against them. These were lessons that would inform military doctrine throughout the Cold War. The Battle of Bastogne wasn't just a victory for the 101st Airborne or for the American forces. It was a victory for every soldier who would ever face overwhelming odds in the future. In the years following the battle, McAuliffe's story would be told and retold. His legendary nuts response became part of American military folklore, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, defiance and courage could turn the tide of battle. McAuliffe would go on to a distinguished career after the war, rising to the rank of four-star general and serving in key positions, including commander of the U.S. Army in Europe during the Cold War. His legacy would live on, not just through his military achievements, but through the example he set for generations of soldiers to come. As we look back on the Battle of Bastogne today, it's easy to see why it remains one of the most iconic moments of World War II. The bravery, the sacrifice, and the unrelenting will to win of the American forces in Bastogne were unmatched. They held the line against one of the most formidable enemies in the world, and in doing so they turned the course of the war. It wasn't just a victory for the Allies, it was a victory for the human spirit. And as we reflect on this incredible chapter of history, we are reminded that in times of adversity, it's not always the size of the army that determines the outcome. It's the strength of the will. The defenders of Bastogne proved that in the end, it's not about how many men you have, how much ammunition you've got, or how deep your supplies go. It's about the will to stand your ground, to fight for what's right, and to never give up no matter the odds. So what can we take from this story? It's a reminder that even when the situation seems impossible, there is always a way forward. The men of Bastogne didn't just defend a town, they defended freedom. They defended their comrades, and they proved that the strength of determination can overcome any obstacle. As we close this chapter, remember that stories like this are what shape our understanding of history. The courage and perseverance of those who fought in Bastogne should never be forgotten, and their legacy continues to inspire us today. Their victory was not just a military one, it was a triumph of the human spirit. If you've enjoyed this incredible story of bravery, resilience, and triumph against overwhelming odds, make sure to hit more subscribes and like this video. Your support helps us bring these amazing, untold stories to light. Every week we share more tales of courage, history, and human spirit that deserve to be remembered. Don't miss out on the next chapter. We've got many more remarkable stories to share with you, so go ahead, hit that subscribing button now. Because the stories of history are waiting and you won't want to miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.